The orbital palace of Larissa did not sleep. It hummed, breathed, and whispered through its endless corridors as if the structure itself were alive, its metal bones resonating with the distant pulse of engines holding the station steady above the cloud-wrapped giant below. Marcus had lived inside that humming world for nearly 5 years, long enough that silence now felt unnatural to him. When he once visited a mining outpost where the air recyclers ran almost noiselessly, he had woken in the middle of the night convinced he had gone deaf. His duties were not grand. He was a court attendant, which meant he maintained ceremonial halls, calibrated lighting fields, adjusted climate balances, and occasionally carried objects of enormous symbolic importance that turned out to weigh less than a kitchen plate. Once he had spent 3 hours polishing a silver sphere that, according to official records, represented the unity of 17 systems. Marcus privately believed it represented the tendency of powerful people to invent work for others. Still, he liked observing the court. The palace attracted beings from across known space, and even after years he sometimes had to stop himself from staring. Tall envoys with translucent skin that shimmered like glass, traders whose voices vibrated through the floor rather than the air, diplomats who wore breathing veils filled with violet mist. Marcus had seen them all, and he had learned that the stranger someone looked, the more likely they were to argue about very ordinary things like shipping tariffs or seating arrangements. Seating arrangements, in fact, were a frequent cause of near catastrophe. Marcus once witnessed two ambassadors nearly derail a treaty because one chair was positioned 12 centimeters closer to the central dais than the other. The argument lasted so long that Marcus had quietly moved both chairs back by exactly 12 centimeters, which satisfied everyone and proved, in his opinion, that most crises were simply geometry in disguise. Yet for all the palace's absurdities, there was one presence that silenced every corridor and tightened every conversation. Queen Thyra. Marcus had seen her many times, though always from a respectful distance. She looked, at first glance, like a human woman, tall, composed, her dark hair often arranged in intricate patterns that seemed almost architectural, but her long, elegant ears marked her as one of the Erithari, a people whose lifespans stretched far beyond human reckoning and whose histories were measured in centuries rather than years. There was a stillness to her movements, a precision that made even the air seem to hesitate around her. The stories about her were endless. Some claimed she could remember every face she had ever seen. Others insisted she once dismissed an entire council with a single sentence so cutting that no one spoke for several minutes afterward. One particularly dramatic guard swore she had once sentenced a traitor without raising her voice above a whisper, which Marcus suspected said more about the guard's imagination than the queen's habits. What Marcus noticed, however, were smaller things. Once, while adjusting the illumination panels in a balcony chamber, he saw Thyra standing alone, looking down at the swirling storms of the planet below. She had been so still that for a moment Marcus thought she might be asleep on her feet. Then she sighed, a quiet human sound, and the illusion of the untouchable monarch cracked just slightly. That was the moment Marcus began to wonder whether the queen was as fearsome as everyone believed, or whether fear itself had grown larger than the truth. On the morning of the diplomatic convocation, the palace felt different. The air carried a subtle tension, like the moment before a thunderclap. Delegations from 3 systems were arriving, and the schedule was so precise that even the service drones moved with unusual urgency, gliding past one another like nervous fish. Marcus spent the early hours adjusting the atmospheric regulators in the Grand Hall. The chamber was vast, its ceiling a transparent dome through which distant stars shone in cold brilliance. Suspended light orbs drifted in slow, deliberate patterns, programmed to mimic the motion of constellations. It was beautiful, in a way that made Marcus slightly uncomfortable, as if beauty on that scale required too much effort to maintain. By midday, the hall filled with officials and attendants. Conversations murmured like distant rain. Marcus passed a group of junior officers arguing in hushed voices about whether bowing too deeply might appear theatrical. One of them attempted to demonstrate and nearly lost his balance, catching himself on a decorative column while pretending he had meant to examine it closely. Marcus kept walking, biting the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. Humor, he had learned, was safest when silent. As the hour approached, the tension thickened. Even the air seemed heavier. Though Marcus knew that was impossible, the climate systems maintained perfect balance at all times. Still, perception was powerful. Fear, especially shared fear, had weight. Then the herald's voice echoed through the chamber, announcing the queen's arrival. Everyone straightened at once, as if pulled by invisible strings. Conversations died. Footsteps ceased. The great doors parted, and Queen Thyra entered, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. The hall seemed to shrink around her, not physically, but in the way attention itself narrowed, focusing entirely on a single figure. Marcus watched from the edge of the chamber, as he always did. He studied the way she moved, the precise rhythm of her steps, the faint glimmer of the silver ornaments woven into her dark hair. He wondered, not for the first time, what it must be like to live surrounded by such silence, such distance, such relentless expectation. And he wondered whether anyone, in all the years of her reign, had ever spoken to her without fear in their voice. The thought lingered with him as the ceremony began, and though he did not yet know it, that quiet curiosity, so small, so ordinary, was already pulling him toward a moment that would change not only his life, but the rhythm of the entire court. The ceremony unfolded with the slow precision of a machine designed by perfectionists. Every movement had meaning, every pause had weight, and every word spoken by the herald seemed to echo longer than necessary, as if the air itself were reluctant to let sound fade too quickly. Marcus stood near one of the illumination pillars, monitoring the light levels on a discrete wrist console, though in truth the system required almost no supervision. Mostly he watched. Ambassadors advanced one by one, each offering formal greetings in their own customs. One delegation communicated entirely through a small floating prism that translated pulses of colored light into speech, which meant every sentence was preceded by a faint flicker of green and violet. Marcus found it oddly cheerful, like listening to someone speak while surrounded by festive decorations. Another envoy spoke so slowly that Marcus briefly wondered whether the translator had malfunctioned, only to realize that the being's natural speech simply operated at a pace that made glaciers look impatient. Despite the grandeur, Marcus sensed a subtle strain in the hall. Diplomacy was often described as graceful, but he had come to think of it more as balancing on a narrow ledge while smiling politely at everyone around you. One wrong word could send negotiations tumbling into the abyss, and everyone knew it. Queen Thyra listened to each envoy with composed attention, her expression calm, her posture unmoving. Yet Marcus, watching closely, began to notice tiny shifts, the faint tightening of her fingers against the armrest of the dais, the slight tilt of her head as if she were concentrating more than usual. Leadership, he thought, must feel like carrying a conversation on behalf of an entire world while pretending it weighed nothing at all. At one point, a minor trade representative from a distant mining consortium became so nervous during his speech that he dropped his datapad. It clattered loudly across the polished floor, the sound startling in the otherwise controlled silence. The man froze, staring at the device as if it had betrayed him personally. After a long, painful second, he bent to retrieve it, nearly knocking his own forehead against the lectern in the process. Marcus heard a faint sound and realized, with mild astonishment, that it was the Queen suppressing a laugh. It was subtle, barely more than an exhale, but it was unmistakably human. The representative, too flustered to notice, resumed his speech, now gripping the datapad with both hands as if it might attempt another escape. The moment passed quickly, but Marcus found himself thinking about it. It was difficult to reconcile the woman who had just nearly laughed at a nervous diplomat with the figure of fear described in so many whispered stories. As the proceedings continued, Marcus moved quietly along the edge of the hall, checking environmental readings and adjusting a temperature gradient near the ambassadorial seating. One of the service drones hovered beside him, projecting a small interface panel. "Humidity within optimal parameters," the drone announced in a calm, pleasant voice. "I'm relieved," Marcus murmured. "I was worried the entire diplomatic process might collapse due to insufficient moisture." The drone paused, as if considering whether this was a serious remark. "Diplomatic collapse probability remains within acceptable margins," it replied. Marcus blinked, then chuckled under his breath. Even the machines here took everything literally. Hours passed, though time in the grand hall seemed to move differently, stretched by formality and repetition. Marcus found his attention drifting, his thoughts wandering to trivial matters like whether the kitchen staff would still have any of the sweet, spiced pastries left when his shift ended. He was considering this deeply important question when he noticed something that pulled his focus back at once. From where he stood, he had a clear view of the queen's profile. Her hair, arranged in an intricate structure of braided strands and delicate silver pins, was a masterpiece of careful design. But now, as she inclined her head slightly to listen to a delegate, Marcus saw a single pin shift. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but he had spent years noticing small things. A strand loosened, then another, the structure beginning to relax in a way that would soon become visible to everyone in the hall. He felt a flicker of unease. In a gathering where appearances carried as much weight as treaties, such a mishap would not go unnoticed. Marcus looked around. The attendants nearest the dais were focused on their assigned tasks, eyes lowered, attention fixed anywhere but the queen herself. No one else seemed to have seen. He told himself it was not his responsibility. Protocol was clear, and the distance between attendant and monarch was measured not just in steps, but in rules, expectations, and centuries of tradition. Yet the loose strands slipped further. Marcus shifted his weight, glancing again toward the dais. The queen remained composed, unaware of the slow unraveling beginning just behind her ear. The sight filled him with an odd, irrational sense of urgency, like watching a glass tilt toward the edge of a table in slow motion. He exhaled quietly, telling himself to ignore it. But the thought would not leave him. Somewhere beneath the layers of ceremony and fear, he saw not a distant ruler, but a person about to suffer an entirely preventable embarrassment in front of half the known galaxy. Marcus had never been very good at pretending not to see problems. It was, he suspected, the reason he was an excellent attendant and a very poor politician. He glanced once more at the shifting strand of hair, then at the silent, motionless guards, and felt a strange certainty settle over him. Not courage exactly, but something quieter, more stubborn. And without yet realizing he had made a decision, Marcus began to move. Marcus did not feel brave as he approached the dais. In fact, he felt extremely aware of his own heartbeat, which seemed to have decided this was the perfect moment to practice percussion. Each step sounded far louder to him than it possibly could to anyone else, and he briefly wondered whether the gravity plates had been secretly replaced with drums. The nearest guard noticed him first. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, not in alarm, but in confusion. Attendants did not usually approach the queen during formal proceedings unless summoned. Marcus gave a small, apologetic nod as he passed, the kind of nod that said, "I know this looks strange, but please assume I have a reason." The guard hesitated. Protocol demanded intervention. Curiosity, however, can be a powerful opponent of protocol. Marcus reached the base of the dais just as another ambassador concluded a speech that had lasted so long, Marcus suspected it might qualify as a geological era on the ambassador's homeworld. The hall was silent in that suspended moment before the next speaker began, and it was in that quiet that Marcus stepped forward. Up close, the queen's presence was even more striking. There was a stillness around her, a sense of controlled energy, like the calm surface of a deep ocean. For a fraction of a second, Marcus considered turning back. He imagined the headlines that would follow his execution and wondered whether anyone would spell his name correctly. Then he saw the strand of hair slipping further, the silver pin nearly loose, and the hesitation vanished. He raised his hand slowly, carefully, as one might approach a delicate instrument. His fingers found the pin, cool and smooth, and with gentle precision he guided it back into place, gathering the loose strands and securing them with practiced ease. Years of adjusting ceremonial fabrics and repairing ornamental displays had given him steady hands, and the motion felt strangely natural, as if he were fixing a curtain rather than touching the most powerful person in 3 systems. The hall fell silent. Not the ordinary silence of formal ceremony, but a deeper, heavier quiet, the kind that feels as though sound itself has been erased. Marcus became aware all at once of dozens, perhaps hundreds of eyes fixed upon him. He finished adjusting the final strand and lowered his hand. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Queen Thyra turned her head slightly, her long ear brushing softly against the restored arrangement of hair. Her eyes met his. They were not cold as the stories claimed. They were sharp, yes, and observant, but there was also curiosity there, and something else Marcus could not immediately name. "You saw a problem," she said quietly. Her voice carried, not because it was loud, but because the hall was so still that even a whisper traveled like a bell. "Yes, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, realizing too late that his voice sounded almost normal, as if he were answering a question about lighting calibration. "And you chose to fix it," she continued. Marcus considered this. It seemed practical. A faint ripple passed through the assembly, the diplomatic equivalent of collective disbelief. Somewhere in the hall, a translator device emitted a soft, confused chirp, as if unsure how to interpret the situation. For a long second, the Queen studied him. Marcus became acutely aware that this was the moment in which his fate would be decided, and he found himself thinking, quite irrationally, that he should have eaten one more of the spiced pastries that morning. It seemed a poor decision in retrospect to face possible execution on an empty stomach. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, Queen Thyra inclined her head slightly. "Thank you," she said. The words settled over the hall like snowfall. Marcus blinked, certain he had misheard. But the Queen had already turned her attention back to the assembled delegates, signaling for the ceremony to continue as if nothing unusual had occurred. Nothing unusual. The herald, who had clearly forgotten how to breathe, took several seconds to recover before announcing the next speaker in a voice that wavered only slightly. The diplomats resumed their formal composure, though Marcus could see that many of them were still staring at him with expressions ranging from fascination to mild existential crisis. Marcus stepped back from the dais, resisting the urge to hurry. Running, he suspected, would give the impression of guilt, and he was fairly certain he had just been thanked rather than condemned, which seemed like an achievement worth preserving. As he returned to his position near the illumination pillar, the same service drone hovered beside him. "Your heart rate is elevated," the drone observed. "I noticed," Marcus muttered. "Would you like a calming beverage recommendation?" Marcus glanced at the drone. "Yes," he said, "preferably one that erases the last 30 seconds from my memory. I regret to inform you that such beverages are restricted to senior medical personnel," the drone replied. "Of course they are," Marcus sighed. Across the hall, he noticed something else unusual. The guards stationed near the dais were no longer watching only the crowd. Several of them were watching him, their expressions thoughtful rather than hostile, as if reassessing something they had long taken for granted. And Queen Thyra, though she continued to listen to the speakers with composed attention, seemed different. Not visibly, not in any way that could be described easily, but Marcus sensed a subtle shift, like the change in air pressure before a storm, or perhaps before clear skies. He exhaled slowly, realizing that the moment had passed, and yet somehow had not passed at all. Something had changed, though he could not yet see the shape of it. All he knew was that he had touched the hair of the alien woman everyone feared, and instead of punishment, he had been given gratitude. And in the vast, carefully ordered world of the palace, that was more unsettling than any execution could have been. The ceremony ended hours later, though Marcus could barely remember what had been said. Trade corridors had been negotiated, border disputes politely reframed as temporary navigational misunderstandings, and at one point 2 delegates argued for 10 minutes about whether a star could legally be described as shared, which Marcus suspected the star itself would have found amusing. What lingered in his mind, however, was the silence after the Queen had thanked him. When the final formalities concluded, the hall slowly dissolved into smaller conversations. Diplomats gathered in clusters, translators hummed, and the tension that had gripped the chamber loosened just enough for people to breathe normally again. Marcus began quietly checking the environmental panels, trying to appear as ordinary as possible, though he had the uncomfortable sensation of being watched from several directions at once. He was adjusting the light gradient near the eastern archway when a voice behind him said, You realize most people would have fainted before doing what you did. Marcus turned to find one of the palace archivists standing nearby, a thin man named Ilian, who seemed to exist primarily in dusty rooms filled with holographic records. Marcus had once asked him how many historical documents he had cataloged, and Ilian had replied, quite seriously, all of them, which Marcus still suspected was not entirely a joke. I didn't really think about it, Marcus said. That, Ilian replied, is what makes it remarkable. Marcus was about to respond when a pair of guards approached. Their armor reflected the hall's soft light, and their expressions were polite but unmistakably formal. Attendant Marcus, one of them said, Her Majesty requests your presence. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Gratitude during a ceremony was one thing. A private audience was another matter entirely, and his imagination immediately began producing a variety of unpleasant possibilities, most of which involved long speeches about protocol, followed by very short endings. He followed the guards through a series of corridors that gradually grew quieter, the sounds of the palace fading into a distant hum. The walls here were lined with transparent panels that revealed the vastness of space beyond, stars scattered like frost across black glass. Marcus had always liked this part of the palace. It reminded him that even the grandest halls were small compared to the universe outside. At last they reached a chamber Marcus had never entered before. The doors parted silently, and the guards stepped aside. Queen Thyra stood near a wide observation window, her hands clasped behind her back as she looked out at the storm-wrapped planet below. Without the formal setting of the court, she seemed different, less distant, though no less composed. The intricate structure of her hair had been partially loosened, and a few strands fell freely over her shoulders. Marcus stepped inside, acutely aware of the quiet. "Attendant Marcus," she said without turning, "you may come closer." He obeyed, stopping several steps behind her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The planet below turned slowly, vast clouds swirling in luminous bands. "You have served in the palace for how long?" she asked at last. "5 years, Your Majesty." "And in those 5 years, have you often acted without considering the consequences?" Marcus considered this carefully. "Only when the consequences seemed less important than the problem, Your Majesty." She turned then, studying him with an expression that was not severe, but thoughtful. "Most people here," she said, "consider consequences before anything else. They measure every word, every movement, until even breathing becomes a decision." Marcus nodded. "I've noticed, Your Majesty. I once saw 2 ministers spend half an hour deciding who should walk through a doorway first. In the end, they both tried at once and became stuck." For a brief second, Thyra looked as if she might laugh. The corner of her mouth twitched, and the severity of her expression softened. "That does sound like this court," she said. The tension in the room eased, just slightly, like a knot loosening. "You saw that my hair was coming undone," she continued. "Why did you not assume that one of my attendants would correct it?" Marcus hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because none of them were looking at you, Your Majesty. They were looking at the floor, or the walls, or anywhere else they thought was safe." She was silent for a moment, absorbing this. "Fear," she said quietly, "is an efficient tool, but it is also a lonely one." Marcus did not know how to respond to that, so he said nothing. Thyra turned back to the window. "When I was younger," she said, "I believed that distance made a ruler strong, that if no one dared approach, no one could threaten you. But distance has a cost. You begin to wonder whether anyone sees you at all." Marcus found himself speaking before he had fully decided to. "I think they see you, Your Majesty. They're just too busy being afraid to notice what they see." The words hung in the air, and Marcus immediately wondered whether he had just committed a new and creative form of treason. But Thyra only nodded, as if he had confirmed something she already suspected. After a moment, she said, "You treated me as a person who needed help, not as an untouchable symbol. That is rare here." Marcus shifted slightly. "It seemed like the right thing to do." "Yes," she said. "It did." They stood in silence for a while, watching the slow rotation of the planet below. Lightning flickered within the clouds, silent at this distance. At last Thyra said, "You will continue your duties as before, but from time to time I may ask for your assistance directly." Marcus blinked. My assistance, Your Majesty? You see things others overlook, she said simply. That is more valuable than most realize. He inclined his head, unsure what else to say. As he turned to leave, she added, "And Marcus," he paused. "If you ever notice my hair coming undone again," she said, her tone almost amused, "you may correct it without waiting for an invitation." Marcus allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "I will do my best, Your Majesty, though I hope it does not become a regular responsibility." "I assure you," she replied, "the palace employs an entire staff for that purpose." As he left the chamber, the tension that had gripped him since the ceremony finally began to fade. The corridors felt the same as before, the hum of the station as familiar as ever. Yet something had shifted, not in the palace perhaps, but in the invisible space between people. And for the first time since arriving at the palace 5 years earlier, Marcus felt that the vast, echoing halls were not quite so distant as they had once seemed. The days following the ceremony did not return to normal, though at first glance everything appeared unchanged. The palace still hummed with its steady mechanical heartbeat. Diplomats still argued in measured tones, and the service drones still announced humidity levels with the same calm authority as if moisture were a matter of galactic importance. Yet Marcus began to notice subtle differences, small shifts that were easy to miss unless one was looking carefully. People looked at him, not openly, not rudely, but with quiet curiosity, as if trying to solve a puzzle. A junior officer once walked directly into a doorway while staring at Marcus, then pretended he had meant to inspect the doorframe for structural weaknesses. Marcus decided not to point out that the doorframe was made of reinforced alloy designed to withstand meteor impacts. Word had spread, of course. Palaces were efficient machines for distributing information, particularly the kind that was not supposed to spread. Marcus overheard fragments of conversation wherever he went. "Touched her hair, they say. And she thanked him. Impossible." Marcus found the situation faintly absurd. He had adjusted a pin. He had not negotiated a treaty, defeated an invading fleet, or discovered a new form of faster-than-light travel. Yet the court reacted as if he had rewritten the laws of physics. One afternoon, while recalibrating a projection grid in a smaller reception chamber, Marcus was approached by Lyra, one of the Queen's senior attendants. She was known throughout the palace for her impeccable composure and her ability to silence entire rooms with a single raised eyebrow. "I have a question," she said. Marcus straightened slightly. "Yes? What?" she asked. "Possessed you?" Marcus considered this. "A loose pin," he said. For a moment Lyra stared at him. Then unexpectedly she laughed. A quick, quiet sound, as if she were surprised by herself. "I suppose," she said, "that is the most honest answer I have heard all week." She lingered for a moment, then added more thoughtfully, "You should know. Her Majesty has been different." "Different how?" Marcus asked. "She has begun asking questions," Lyra said. "Not about treaties or fleet movements. About people. About how the staff live, how the palace operates beyond what reports say. Yesterday she asked how long it takes a service drone to cross the eastern corridor during peak hours." Marcus blinked. Why would she want to know that? "I have no idea," Lyra admitted, but she listened very carefully to the answer. Marcus returned to his work, but her words stayed with him. That evening he was summoned again, not to the private chamber overlooking the planet, but to a smaller garden dome deep within the palace. The space was unlike any other part of the station, filled with living plants from a dozen worlds, their leaves glowing faintly in shades of blue and gold. A narrow stream flowed through the center, its surface reflecting the artificial twilight above. Queen Thyra stood near the water, watching a small floating creature that drifted just above the surface like a living lantern. "You wish to see me, Your Majesty?" Marcus said. "Yes," she replied, turning toward him. "Walk with me." They moved slowly along the path. The air was warm, scented faintly with unfamiliar blossoms. "I have lived in this palace for many years," Thyra said, "yet there are parts of it I have never seen. Gardens like this were designed for ambassadors, for guests, not for rulers." Marcus glanced around. "It seems a shame not to use them. They're too pleasant to waste on diplomats." She gave him a brief, amused look. You do not think highly of diplomats. I think highly of some of them, Marcus said, just not all at once. They walked in silence for a time, listening to the quiet murmur of the stream. At the ceremony, Thyra said at last, when you approached me, were you afraid? Marcus considered the question carefully. Yes, he said. Very. Then why did you not stop? He shrugged slightly. Because I thought you might be embarrassed. And embarrassment is a terrible thing to endure in front of hundreds of people. I once tripped while carrying a tray in the Grand Hall. I considered moving to another planet. Thyra laughed softly, the sound blending with the water. I see, she said. They reached a small clearing where luminous flowers opened and closed in slow, rhythmic patterns, responding to subtle changes in light. Marcus watched them for a moment, fascinated. They look like they're breathing, he said. They are, Thyra replied. In a way, they absorb trace radiation and convert it into energy. On their homeworld, entire fields of them glow at night like stars fallen to the ground. Marcus shook his head. The universe is full of strange things. Yes, she said quietly, and yet the strangest thing I have seen in many years was an attendant who ignored centuries of protocol to spare me a moment's discomfort. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, unsure how to respond. After a moment, Thyra said, I have been thinking about fear. That sounds dangerous, Marcus said. She glanced at him. Dangerous? Yes. Thinking leads to change, and change makes people nervous, especially people who like things exactly as they are. And you, she asked, do you like things exactly as they are? Marcus looked around the glowing garden, then up at the artificial sky, then back at her. No, he said, I don't think I ever have. They stood there for a while, the quiet settling comfortably between them. Somewhere in the garden, a small creature chirped, a bright musical sound that echoed faintly through the dome. At last, Thyra said, I believe this palace has been too silent for too long. Marcus smiled faintly. Silence is overrated. Yes, she said, I am beginning to think so. And as they walked back along the glowing path, Marcus realized that something larger than either of them was changing. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, like the turning of a great wheel that had been motionless for far too long. Change did not arrive in the palace like a storm. It arrived like a draft under a closed door, barely noticeable at first, yet impossible to ignore once you felt it. Marcus began to see it in small things. The guards at the Grand Hall no longer stood quite so rigidly when the Queen passed. Their posture was still formal, but their eyes were less strained, less fixed in that constant effort to appear flawless. The attendants spoke a little more freely among themselves, and once, something Marcus would have sworn impossible a month earlier, he heard laughter echoing from a corridor just after the Queen herself had walked through it. The court, however, did not change all at once. Some ministers watched these subtle shifts with visible discomfort, like people observing cracks forming in a wall they had always believed unbreakable. Marcus noticed this most clearly during a council session he had been assigned to assist. His task was simple: monitor the atmospheric settings and ensure the projection field remained stable while the ministers debated trade allocations. It was not a difficult assignment, though it required patience, and patience was a skill Marcus possessed in abundance. The debate, however, tested even that skill. For the third time, one minister was saying, the transport corridor must remain under joint supervision. And for the third time, another replied, joint supervision is inefficient. You mistake efficiency for control, and you mistake control for wisdom. Marcus adjusted a temperature dial slightly, wondering whether it would be considered treason to lower the oxygen level just enough to encourage shorter speeches. At the head of the chamber, Queen Thyra listened in silence. Marcus had grown accustomed to watching her expressions, the subtle shifts that others often missed. Today she seemed less distant, more present, as if she were not merely presiding, but observing in a deeper way. At one point, the debate began circling the same argument for the fifth time. Marcus was certain of the number because he had started counting, mostly to remain sane. Then Thyra spoke. Ministers, she said calmly, if repetition solved problems, this matter would already be resolved. The room fell silent. Marcus bit the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling. The discussion moved forward after that, though somewhat more cautiously, as if the ministers were suddenly aware that the Queen was not only listening, but also thinking in ways they had not anticipated. Later that afternoon, Marcus was crossing a long observation corridor when he noticed two guards standing near the viewport, speaking in low voices. They fell silent when they saw him. Then one of them said, almost awkwardly, "You're Marcus, aren't you?" "I am," Marcus replied. The guard shifted slightly. "Is it true that Her Majesty asked your opinion about the garden lighting?" Marcus nodded. "She asked whether the blue luminescence was too bright. And what did you say?" "I said it made the flowers look like they were glowing from the inside, which seemed appropriate, since they actually are." The guards exchanged glances. "That's all?" one asked. "That's all," Marcus said. They looked faintly disappointed, as if expecting a more dramatic answer. Marcus walked on, reflecting that people often preferred extraordinary explanations, even when the truth was simple. That evening he was summoned once again, this time to a chamber he had never seen before. It was smaller than the council rooms, lined with shelves containing physical objects rather than holographic displays, artifacts from distant worlds, fragments of ancient technology, even what appeared to be a small meteorite resting on a stand. Queen Thyra stood near a table, examining a device that looked like a miniature star enclosed in glass. It pulsed softly, casting shifting patterns of light across the walls. "What is that?" Marcus asked before he could stop himself. "A contained fusion fragment," she said. "Harmless in this state. It was once part of a propulsion core." Marcus leaned closer, fascinated. "It's beautiful." "Yes," she said. "Power often is, when it is not being used to destroy something." She turned toward him. "I have been reading reports," she said. "Records of the court from many years ago. There was a time when this palace was not so silent." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You mean people used to talk?" "They used to speak without fear," she said. Marcus considered this. "That sounds noisy." "It was," she said, and there was a hint of warmth in her voice. They spoke for a while about small things, the way the palace lighting changed color during artificial dawn, the peculiar habits of the service drones, the strange music sometimes transmitted from distant stations. Marcus found himself forgetting, at moments, that he was speaking to a monarch at all. At one point, a maintenance drone drifted into the chamber, paused, and announced, "Air quality optimal." "Thank you," Marcus said. The drone lingered, then added, "Conversation quality also appears optimal." Marcus blinked. "Since when do you evaluate conversation quality?" "I am updating my observational parameters," the drone replied, and drifted away. Thyra looked at Marcus, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she laughed softly, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to brighten the room more than the fusion fragment ever could. "It appears," she said, "that even the machines are learning to observe more closely." Marcus smiled. "They have good examples." Silence followed, but it was not the heavy silence of ceremony. It was the quiet of two people thinking. At last Thyra said, "Do you know what surprises me most about all this?" "What, Your Majesty?" "That nothing truly changed in a single moment," she said. "Not when you approached me, not when I thanked you. The change was already waiting. It only needed a beginning." Marcus looked at the softly glowing fragment on the table, its light steady and contained. "A small spark," he said. "Yes," she replied. "A small spark." And as Marcus left the chamber, walking once more through the long, humming corridors of the palace, he felt that spark everywhere. In the quieter voices, the lighter footsteps, the subtle easing of tension that had once seemed permanent. The palace was still vast, still filled with protocol and power and the endless machinery of empire. But it was no longer quite so cold. And Marcus began to understand that sometimes the greatest changes in the universe did not begin with explosions or revolutions, but with something far simpler. Someone noticing something small and caring enough to act. The palace moved through its cycles as it always had. Artificial dawn, measured daylight, the slow dimming into simulated night. But Marcus began to notice that the rhythms felt different now, less rigid, as if the vast structure itself had learned to breathe more easily. Weeks had passed since the ceremony, and the small changes that once seemed tentative had taken root. The ministers still argued, but their voices carried less sharpness. The attendants still bowed, but not with the same rigid fear that had once stiffened every movement. Even the guards seemed more at ease, occasionally exchanging quiet remarks instead of standing in absolute silence, like statues carved from alloy. Marcus found himself changing as well, though he did not realize it at first. He spoke more openly, not boldly, but with a quiet confidence that had not been there before. He had discovered something simple and powerful, that most of the barriers he had feared were made not of law or punishment, but of imagination. One evening, while adjusting the projection field in the grand hall, he overheard two junior attendants arguing in hushed voices. "You can't just speak to her," one was saying. "You have to wait to be addressed." "Marcus speaks to her," the other replied. "That's different." "Why?" There was a pause. "I don't know," the first admitted at last. Marcus pretended not to hear, but he smiled faintly as he continued his work. Not long after, a message arrived requesting his presence. Not in a council chamber or garden, but on the outer observation deck, a place rarely used except during astronomical events. Marcus made his way there, curious. The doors opened to reveal a vast expanse of transparent shielding in the endless darkness beyond. The gas giant below filled half the sky, its storms glowing in slow, majestic spirals. Queen Thyra stood near the railing, her long ears outlined in the pale light of distant stars. "You wish to see me, Your Majesty?" Marcus said. "Yes," she replied. "Come here." He joined her at the edge of the deck. For a while neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the distant hum of the station and the silent motion of the universe. "Do you remember," Thyra said at last, "what you told me in the garden? That silence is overrated." Marcus nodded. "I stand by that." She smiled slightly. "So do I." She gestured toward the planet below. "When I first came here, I believed that ruling meant standing apart. That distance created strength, but distance also creates blindness. I could not see what my court had become, or what I myself had become." Marcus considered this. "You saw it eventually." "Yes," she said, "because someone reminded me that I was still a person." Marcus shifted, slightly uncomfortable with the weight of the words. "I only fixed a pin," he said. "You did more than that," Thyra replied quietly. "You showed me that fear had built walls I did not need." A faint movement overhead drew Marcus's attention. He looked up to see a formation of ships emerging from the far side of the station. Small, gleaming vessels escorting a diplomatic convoy departing for distant systems. Their engines flared briefly, then faded as they slipped into the dark, vanishing like sparks carried away by the wind. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Thyra asked suddenly. Marcus blinked. "Leaving the palace?" "Yes, seeing other worlds, living another life." He thought about it seriously. Once the idea would have filled him with longing, but now standing here, he realized something had changed. "I used to," he said. "I thought adventure meant going somewhere far away. But now I think sometimes adventure is staying where you are and changing what you can." Thyra studied him, and there was approval in her expression. "You have changed," she said. Marcus smiled slightly. "So have you." They stood in companionable silence for a time. A maintenance drone drifted past, paused, and announced, "Stellar visibility excellent." "Thank you," Marcus said automatically. The drone hovered a moment, then added, "Emotional atmosphere also excellent." Marcus glanced at Thyra. She raised an eyebrow. "They're learning," he said. "It appears so," she replied. At last Thyra turned back to the stars. "There is one more thing," she said. "Tomorrow I will address the court. I intend to change certain protocols, not to abandon order, but to remove the fear that serves no purpose." Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction at this, though he knew the change would not be easy. Old habits, like old stars, did not fade quickly. "It will take time," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but time is something I have learned to use, rather than endure." The following day, the court gathered in the grand hall. The ministers stood in their usual places, though the atmosphere carried an undercurrent of curiosity. When Queen Thyra spoke, her voice was calm but clear. She spoke of strength and of fear, and of the difference between the two. She spoke of the purpose of authority, not as a barrier, but as a responsibility. And she spoke, briefly but unmistakably, of the value of small acts, of attention, of kindness, of courage that does not announce itself with fanfare. Marcus stood among the attendants, listening. No one mentioned his name, yet he felt the echo of that moment in every word. When the address ended, there was no stunned silence this time, only thoughtful quiet, like the pause after the first light of dawn. Life in the palace continued as it always would. Ships arrived and departed, diplomats argued and reconciled. The storms of the gas giant turned endlessly below. But something essential had changed. One evening, weeks later, Marcus found himself again in the garden dome, watching the luminous flowers open and close in their slow rhythm. Thyra joined him, and they walked along the stream, speaking of ordinary things, of the peculiar habits of ambassadors, of the strange music drifting from distant stations, of the way the stars looked different from each balcony of the palace. At one point, a strand of her hair slipped loose in the warm air. Marcus glanced at it, then at her. She looked back at him, amused. "Well?" she said. Marcus reached up, adjusted the strand, and stepped back. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he replied. They both laughed quietly, and the sound carried softly through the glowing garden. And in that simple, ordinary moment, Marcus understood something he had not fully realized before. The universe was vast, filled with wonders beyond counting, but sometimes the most important changes began with the smallest gestures. An act of kindness, a moment of courage, a hand raised not in power, but in help. The palace lights dimmed gradually, and the stars beyond the dome shone brighter, silent and eternal, as life within the great station moved forward. Not unchanged, but better, because someone, once, had cared enough to reach out.